John Fetterman is a willing tool of the oligarchs. And why? Because they let him be a senator.
Unless you don't pay attention to the news at all, you're probably aware of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Much to the chagrin of most of the online right and online left, the United States has been very supportive of the Israeli military since the October 7th attack. Back in November, the Biden administration requested an aid package to Israel to the tune of $14.3 billion. This would add to the estimated $130 billion we've sent to Israel over the last 75 years, according to Axios. Furthermore, the Senate just shot down Bernie Sanders' proposal to condition aid to Israel by a vote of 72 to 11, demonstrating that support for Israel is not only the consensus position in Washington, but a bipartisan one at that. Why does the United States support Israel? Well, that depends on who you ask. Personally, I think it's primarily because they're an important strategic ally in the region. But other people have different opinions. There are, of course, people who have really nasty theories about this, pertaining to the ethnicity of some of the people involved. I think you know what I'm talking about. I not only reject that interpretation, I recognize it as the vile paranoia that it is. There's another theory that's essentially an ecumenical, and therefore more benign version of this. Rather than there being one specific ethnic group pulling the puppet strings on everyone and determining everything that happens, it's some nebulous cabal of billionaires and corporate titans.
I do think that there's something to be said for the fact that corporations and oligarchs convinced us all to be conspicuous consumers. Like, I think that was deliberate. I think like turning us all into little fucking wage slaves and shit and teaching us that our fulfillment comes from buying things had a profound effect on society and the credulousness of the world at large. I don't think we're pussies. I think we're exactly what Adam Curtis is describing here. I think we're confounded to the point of being controlled.
Like any good conspiracy theory, it's vague, completely unfalsifiable, and purports to explain absolutely everything. The adherents of this theory predictably explain U.S. support for Israel by saying something something defense contractors, something something AIPAC.
This great strength that AIPAC had, and I remember talking about this with Ari Berman, who wrote a piece about it in The Nation like over a decade ago. And he made a great point. He's like, they actually don't have that much money compared to the giant industries like the drug companies, the banks, etc. But they concentrate their money on races in a way that is so flamboyant, right? That it gets everybody's attention. Hey, we're going to defeat Nina Turner in Cleveland, and we're going to find this hack, this nobody, and we're just going to hand her the election by spending $4 to $6 million to make sure she wins. She's a nobody. She only raised her hand to say, I'm willing to be the most corrupt, and that's why we're giving it to her, in essence, through the ads. And so when people see that, they panic.
Now, like most conspiracy theories, there is some truth to it. There are indeed powerful lobbies that do throw around a lot of cash in the form of campaign donations that do attempt, and often succeed, at influencing politics. My contention is that they use it as a theory of everything. At least everything in politics that they don't like. These people also ignore the influence of big money and lobbying when it comes to things they do like. But that's another video for another day. As an example of this theory in practice, let's take a look at Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman. In case you don't know, John Fetterman is that gigantic dude who wears sweats and shorts everywhere he goes. He very much campaigned as a progressive, with the exception of one issue, which we'll come to, during his 2022 race against television personality Dr. Oz, and was championed by the online left as such. Some even floated him as a potential presidential candidate one day. Fast forward to today, and Fetterman has been denounced as a sellout.
John Fetterman is a willing tool of the oligarchs. And why? Because they let him be a senator.
It was only a matter of time, as these people eventually denounce everyone as a sellout. It was only ever a question of what issue the betrayal would be on. After October 7th, it became clear that Israel was the real dividing line between Fetterman and the online left, as Fetterman is very much pro-Israel and the online left is not. In fairness to the online left, Fetterman retconned much of his history. I'm not a progressive, Fetterman told NBC News. I just think I'm a Democrat that is very committed to choice and other things. But with Israel, I'm going to be on the right side of that. And immigration is something near and dear to me. And I think we do have to effectively address it as well. A quick look at his 2022 campaign will show that this is at odds with much of his rhetoric at the time. With, like I said earlier, one notable exception, Israel. Fetterman always made it clear, both before and after his campaign, that he was squarely in Israel's corner. Why is he at odds with the left on this issue, despite being in line with them on so many other fronts? Well, a narrative has emerged based on reporting by The Intercept's Ryan Grimm.
Just so everybody understands, he made an active decision to go all in, being a pro-Israel sycophant. And it all had to do with, he was afraid when he was running in the primary against Conor Lamb, he was afraid AIPAC was going to send in a bunch of money to support the more centrist Democrat Conor Lamb. So he reached out to AIPAC and DMFI and said, what do you want my position on Israel to be? They gave him his exact position on Israel, and he said, done deal. Stay out of my race in the sense that you don't fund my opponent and maybe give me some contributions, and we're goodsies. He literally had AIPAC and DMFI edit his position on Israel, and he signed off on it. And now all that's coming through.
As is often the case with derivative news shows, a lot of the details get distorted with a secondhand telling of the story. Here's the original reporting. As Ryan Grimm writes in The Squad, AOC and the Hope of a Political Revolution, John Fetterman was locked in what threatened to be a tight primary race with Representative Conor Lamb for a Senate nomination, and Lamb's campaign was openly pleading for super PAC support to put him over the top. Early in the year, Jewish Insider reported, Mark Mellman, a Democratic political consultant, had reached out to Fetterman with questions about his position on Israel. He's never come out and said that he's not a supporter of Israel, but the perception is that he aligns with the Squad more than anything else. Democratic activist Brett Goldman told the news outlet, Mellman said that the Fetterman campaign responded to his inquiry and came with an interest in learning about the issues. The campaign reached out again. They sent us a position paper, which we thought was very strong. But it wasn't quite strong enough. Jewish Insider reported that DMFI, Democratic Majority for Israel, a pro-Israel advocacy organization, emailed back some comments on the paper, which Fetterman was receptive to addressing in a second draft. In April, Fetterman agreed to do an interview with Jewish Insider. I want to go out of my way to make sure that it's absolutely clear that the views I hold in no way go along the lines of some of the more fringe or extreme wings of our party, he said. I would also respectfully say that I'm not really a progressive in that sense. Fetterman, unprompted, stressed that there should be zero conditions on military aid to Israel, that BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, was wrong, and so on. Let me just say this, even if I'm asked or not, I was dismayed by the Iron Dome vote. DMFI and AIPAC, American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, a pro-Israel lobbying organization, stayed out of his race. Now, was what Grimm reported there corruption? Kyle certainly seems to think so. He compared this to what Democratic Senator Bob Menendez has been accused of.
Careful what you wish for, Fetterman, because you are also corrupt. It's just in a slightly different way. Yes, you didn't take luxury cars or have gold bars in your pocket. True. But you literally had AIPAC write your position on Israel.
For the record, Menendez was indicted last year for allegedly, he has yet to be convicted, providing sensitive U.S. government information to the Egyptian government in exchange for money and gifts. Investigators actually found $480,000 in cash and $100,000 worth of gold bars in Menendez's New Jersey residence. Maybe Fetterman took bribes from the Israeli government, but so far, no credible person has even accused him of doing so. But what about those campaign donations? Don't you know those are just bribes by another name?
You know how much the NRA gave the Republican Party in the 2016 election cycle? $50 million. No one in the country thinks it's anything but a bribe.
I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. You cannot actually pocket the money that's been donated to your campaign for public office. You might face criminal charges even if that money is being funneled to you in a way that authorities deem improper. It has happened. Just ask former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. But how much money exactly did Fetterman get from the pro-Israel groups? If you go to Open Secrets, you can actually see the candidates that AIPAC and DMFI donated to during the 2022 election cycle. You will not see John Fetterman's name on either report. AIPAC almost exclusively donated to incumbents that cycle, many of whom were not in close races. Fetterman was in a close race and was not an incumbent. Ironically enough, the candidate who they contributed most to was Bob Menendez, who Fetterman called to be expelled from the Senate. Of the $216,000 the DMFI spent during the 2022 election cycle, all of it went to Democratic candidates, but not a penny went to Fetterman. Both organizations donated plenty of money to other pro-Israeli politicians, but not Fetterman. By the way, links to both of these pages are in the description box below, just in case you want to check for yourself. It's just as Grimm reported, these organizations stayed out of the race. So, you don't even need to get money from one of these organizations to be considered corrupt by certain internet pundits. It's almost as if they think he's corrupt for merely disagreeing with them. Now, if I were to steelman their position, it would go a little something like this. Sure, Fetterman didn't actually take money from these organizations, but he saw them bring the hammer down against pro-Palestinian voices, seeking public office, and he didn't want a target on his back. So he preemptively bowed to the Israel lobby so that he wouldn't face this disadvantage during his campaign.
Even the legendary populist John Fetterman panicked and he said, okay, whatever Israel wants. And he's still saying it to this day. So that is how they use people as an example.
Maybe so. Grimm's reporting made it seem as though Fetterman was more or less a blank slate on this particular issue. But I guess it's possible that Fetterman really believes that the left has the correct position on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and it's just pure cowardice that has driven him to be one of Israel's strongest voices. I don't know. But let's say for the sake of argument that it is true. What the online left and other people who call for campaign finance reform consistently fail to understand is that campaign donations are just a means to an end. You still actually have to get people to vote for you in order to win an election.
Why does no one address the fact that GOP and DNC have so much money they can overpower any third party option? So I think
money
that's,
vote, or do people?
well, I mean, money votes. I get that.
Money has influence for sure.
Yeah, but like
I mean, with
only to the
fucking
extent that people
Citizens
can
United,
be
money.
influenced by slick marketing and shit, which apparently is a lot. But I don't know. I still maintain the dream that one day people will wake up and realize, like, hey, just because I saw a slick advertisement or a social media campaign trying to convince me of something doesn't mean I should just automatically go along with it.
Money can be used to advertise and attempt to persuade people, but it's just that, a tool. If you could, Michael Bloomberg would be our president right now. They think that your average voter is just so stupid that they decide who to vote for based on how many 30-second TV ads they see when they're watching football on Sunday.
Mitch McConnell and a lot of the Republicans trick their voters with money. What does the money do? They get the money from the NRA and then they run ads. They overwhelm sometimes Democrats in their races with ads.
This isn't how it works. Campaign ads are highly ineffective at actually moving the needle on public opinion. Multiple people have debunked the fraudulent statistic about how the candidate who spends more money wins the election 90 billion% of the time, including me. It's a classic case of correlation not implying causation. I'm not going to get into that now, but feel free to watch my video on it. What is actually effective at motivating politicians is interest group pressure, and campaign donations are usually the capstone of that. If you hear special interest group, you probably think of oil companies or financial institutions, and those are certainly examples. But the reality is a lot less grand than that. As Kevin D. Williamson writes, the First Amendment speaks of the right of the people to petition the government, and petitioning the government is what lobbyists do. People think that lobbyists show up at Senator Snout's office with a suitcase full of $100 bills to get him to vote for gun rights, the same way he's always voted for gun rights. That is not how lobbying actually works, usually. And we already have laws against bribery. Molly Ivins, who had the soul of a demagogue, used to bellow, "We the people don't have a lobbyist." But of course we do. If you're a teacher, you have a lobbyist. If you're a doctor, you have a lobbyist. If you sell houses, you have a lobbyist, a big one. If you care about marijuana legalization or tax reform or trade regulation, there's a lobbyist for you. And if there is not a lobbyist for you, you can organize and set up a lobby of your own. Journalists like to think of ourselves as the foot soldiers of free speech, but lobbyists have as much of a claim on that. Democracy is a conversation, and there is evidence to suggest that interest group lobbying often does successfully promote the interests of regular people. As Martin Gillens writes in Affluence and Influence,
on issues such as Social Security, Medicare, school vouchers, and public works spending, policies are more responsive to the preferences of poor and middle-class people than is true for the other issue domains I examine. The reason, I argue, is that poor and middle-income Americans have interest group allies on these issues that they lack elsewhere. The American Association of Retired People, AARP, teachers' unions, the healthcare industry, and other lobbying interests share the preferences of less well-off Americans on these issues and serve to pull policy outcomes in the direction that both the less advantaged and the interest groups prefer.
Martin Gillens, by the way, was one of the co-authors of the study Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens. For those of you who just read headlines out there, that is the actual name of the famous Princeton oligarchy study. The study that didn't actually call the US an oligarchy, even though the press reported it as such, and lots of online pundits regurgitated that uncritically because it validated their priors.
very institutionally cemented parties, but there is a very strong correlation for the most part between what people want and what actually happens in our government. Now, that's not a perfect relationship. Obviously, for one, like
I've
the
read
majority of
studies that
people
say
want.
the opposite, that we're functionally an oligarchy, and that it basically.
I'm familiar with the study you're referring to.
You know, you've heard this study, I'm sure.
Yes, there are critiques of its methodology.
I'm sure at least one moron in the comments section brought up this study when I called American oligarchy a conspiracy theory. If you happen to be one of those morons, I suggest you delete the comments and go actually read the study instead of just the headline of an article that described it. And to Williamson's point about starting a lobbying organization, that's not hypothetical. That's basically what Kyle Kulinski and Cenk Uygur did when they started the Justice Democrats. Justice Democrats run ads for candidates, they donate money to candidates, they do get out the vote efforts for candidates, and presumably, they pressure candidates into supporting certain positions. Or at least they attempt to. It's not like they haven't had their success stories either. The Justice Democrats were instrumental in electing the Squad, the most pro-Palestinian voices in Congress at the moment.
So on this particular issue, I've said this on my show too. First of all, I was surprised. Second of all, it's the most proud I've ever been of the Justice Democrats. As you know, I'm a co-founder of the Justice Democrats. And what you really saw was, I don't remember the exact number, between 15 and 20 Democrats now calling for a ceasefire, and most of them are Justice Democrats.
You have actually 31 Democrats now.
So then
and I
that
think
list
it
has
was
grown.
24 on the latest letter that came out.
That list has grown, and many of them are, you know, the most prominent faces of the Justice Democrats.
So they're not opposed to these things in principle. They just don't like it when other people are more successful at it, and they call it corruption.
And it's a brilliant tactic. It's a tactic I'd like to use at Wolfpack to ironically target all the corrupt congresspeople.
But this is usually a mistake. That's not corruption. You're just bad at this.